And so now I want to take you, as if you were eyewitnesses, to one of the most dramatic series of events in American history. I don't know why they call it the Forgotten War, because during this talk I'm going to tell you how and why the national anthem was written, and I'm going to tell you some stories about true patriots. How come it's a forgotten war? You got the birth of the national anthem, you got Dolly Madison saving her portrait in the White House, you got a guy I'm going to tell you about who saved the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution from destruction by the enemy, and you got Andrew Jackson's victory at New Orleans, a kind of victory that was so sensational that people, when they first heard about it in Washington, didn't believe it. Now, Winston Churchill said this was not a war of independence. Who am I to take issue with Winston Churchill? But I'm courageous enough to take issue with him because he's dead and I can do it. And the man who led the crusade against war was a Virginian, Representative John Randolph of Roanoke, an Anglophile. He argued, how can you take up arms against a people who share the same language, the same blood, the same religion, habeas corpus, representative government, and even, he said, the works of Shakespeare and Newton. Well, Calhoun wasn't going to have any of this. He didn't share any of Randolph's emotional attachment to the colonial power. So he replied, great indeed must be the reason for going to war, if so much had bound us together in the past. And in the summer of 1812, a bitterly divided Congress declared war on Britain. It was as divided as this country was during the Vietnam War. So the British sailed up the Patuxent River and disembarked about 5,000 troops at Benedict on the 19th of August, 1814. The path to the capital was clear. The capital itself was like tethered prey. And as the British began their 50-mile march inland, fear in Washington turned to terror, and terror gave way to pandemonium. It was the hottest summer in memory. It hadn't rained in 3 weeks, so the dry and dusty roads were clogged with desperate refugees, their meager possessions spilling over the sides of the carts and wagons. Transport had become more precious than jewelry. James Madison had already escaped across the river to Virginia, agreeing to meet his wife Dolly at Falls Church. And Dolly refused to leave the White House until she had saved a painting by George Washington, which then hung on the west wall of a large dining room. This was a painting by Gilbert Stuart, the famous artist, and had been acquired by the federal government in 1800 for the White House at a cost of $800. She refused to leave until she had saved this. Now, 2 of her friends came into the White House, Jacob Barker and Robert de Peyster, and asked if they could help. And according to an historian who interviewed them shortly afterwards, she said, save that picture. Under no circumstances allow it to fall into the hands of the British. When she saw that her slave, Paul Jennings, was taking too long to unscrew it, she said, break the wood and take it out. But French John came in. He was in charge of everybody working in the White House, equivalent to today's chief usher. And he could see the potential for damage. So he told him to stop. And with Dolly's approval, he took out his knife and he cut the heavyweight English twill fabric out of its frame. It now measured 95 inches long, 59 3/4 inches wide. And he gave it to one of the New Yorkers, who started to roll it up until it was stopped for fear the paint would crack. They put it flat in a wagon, drove through Georgetown into the countryside, and that night the British burned the White House. Everything was destroyed. A few wobbly walls remained, some incorporated into the modern version, which was completed in 1817. But the only thing in the White House today from before the fire that we're absolutely certain was there before the fire is that painting. It's in the giant East Room, where they have the funerals, weddings, press conferences. If you look over the president's shoulder at the next press conference, you'll see it. And they in turn captured Dr. William Beanes, who was a close friend of Francis Scott Key. Key got the president's permission to board the British ships and plead for his friend's release. And the British commander said, no, you and your friend are both hostages now, because both of you know our target, the strength of our forces, and our morale. Throughout the night, he paced the deck of his ship in the darkness, hoping the explosions would continue, because if there was silence, it might mean the fort had capitulated. But in the darkness before dawn, there was a lull in the firing, and Key didn't know whether the signaled submission by the fort or whether the British had imposed a ceasefire. But gradually the morning mist began to clear, as say can you see by the dawn's early light, and once more he made out the stars and stripes still flying. Never before had the flag had such a sheen to its glory. Never before had he looked with such reverence upon the symbol of his country. In his ecstasy, he took a letter out of his pocket, and on the back of it jotted down thoughts, words, phrases, anything that tumbled through his mind while the intensity of the moment lasted. 3 days later, the British withdrew. They could not subdue Fort McHenry, which they had to do in order to approach Baltimore and seize the city. And so the British withdrew, and the Americans fired a parting shot as a cheeky rebuke from improbable survivors. Key was allowed to land. By now, his poem was crafted and finished. He made some minor revisions overnight, and the next day it was shown around, it was printed, and it was set to the tune of an old English drinking song called To Anacreon in Heaven. Christmas Eve, 1814, commissioners from both countries met in the Belgian city of Ghent to sign a treaty of peace and amity that ended this costly war between the two exhausted nations. John Quincy Adams, leader of the American delegation, went to bed that night having prayed that this would be the last war between the two great English-speaking countries. But it took 4 to 6 weeks for word to cross the Atlantic. Too late for armies squaring off at New Orleans. But the British were impatient. Instead of waiting to take the flank across the Mississippi River, they charged in a frontal assault over a flat field of sugarcane stubble. They had no cover, and they were picked off one after the other. And when it was all over, there were more than 2,000 British casualties. There were 6 American dead and 7 American wounded. So from that moment you could rightfully say America had regained its pride and dignity and won worldwide respect and admiration. The Second War of Independence is well and truly over.